Aristotle. In reading Aristotle's writings, one thing that comes across is his brilliance, and folk, take this any way you want to, but you can fairly well tell how intelligent a person is, number one, by just talking to him a few minutes, not in 1 minute or two, but in 5 minutes, or by reading their writings. Now, I had a younger brother ask me about 30 years ago, what if you marry someone and find out that she's not as intelligent as you thought she was? My answer was, after 5 minutes of talking to him, you'll have some idea what their intellectual level is. There's no place to hide in a relationship. You show your intelligence in ways that you oftentimes wish you didn't, or show your lack thereof. Now, I want to quote a fellow employee at Lockheed several years ago. I want to quote him. I tell you, there ain't nary one of those men in higher up management that has area lick of sense. What was his intellectual level? It wasn't just his bad grammar either. All right, I want to say that you get two people together whose intellectual level is pretty far apart. This one down here will look down on this one up here. The lower intellectual will think, and don't try to argue with someone whose intellect is 2 or 3 notches below yours. Your decisions on every matter there is going to appear to them to be both foolish and immoral. You cannot get anywhere arguing with them because they just perceive a different reality than you do. Having said this, Aristotle was, in fact, an extremely intelligent man. All right, his views, I'll start off with his views on women. Your book mentions this. He viewed women as being they were inferior to the men. He believed that a woman's place was in a home, as did typically Greeks, so he did not copy Plato in that regard. And in fact, I have heard one place, even though I can't verify it right now, but he said women are utterly worthless except that they bear children. Take that away from them, they'd be utterly, totally worthless. This was his view, folk, not mine. But now, Aristotle wrote a large amount of works on science, and in fact, they were the best scientific treatises up to his time. Unfortunately, his books lay in collecting dust for 200 years. They lay in somebody's basement. Finally, somebody dug them up and said, hey, this is great. And he wound up becoming an icon. And even the people of the late Middle Ages, we'll talk about this, late Middle Ages, admired him and looked on him as being a chief source of authority. Among other things he did, he classified plants and animals. His classification might seem weird to us today. He classified bats as being birds because they flew. In other words, if any warm-blooded animal that flew was a bird, if it didn't fly, it was not a bird. So he'd probably not classify an ostrich as being a bird because they don't fly. But today's scientists classify bats as mammals. He classified animals according to whether they bore live young or lay eggs. And this becomes tricky after a while because some fish lay eggs and some fish bear live young. Some mammals lay eggs. Some mammals don't have teeth but have a beak, but they're called mammals because they have fur. And in the past, some birds are known to have had teeth. Today, birds do not have teeth, but the birds in the past are also they had teeth. And some what appear to be reptiles, flying reptiles, apparently had feathers. Now, if you classified things according to their eyes, you'd wind up putting octopi in the same class as octopus, in the same class as humans, because the octopus has human-type eyes. There are several instances in nature. I read an article, there's about 100 known instances in nature where the animals that belong even to different phyla or different classes will have a characteristic that's very similar to one in another phyla or another class. The subject of taxonomy cannot be an exact science. I mean, I once read that there are some fish that scientists will look at a new fish and On the one hand, it should go in this class. On the other hand, it should go in this, and they finally would just arbitrarily put it somewhere, just be putting it somewhere. There's no way to tell where it should go. Classifying flatworms. I took a course in flatworms one time. Believe it or not, I have a minor in biology, an undergraduate minor. Classifying flatworms is really weird in some cases. There's just simply no place to put some of them, so they just simply decide, well, based on where their sex organs appear during a certain stage of life cycle, we'll classify them according to that regard. Without regard, and sometimes the classification is just utterly devoid of any type of logic. Now, we try to classify things based on evolution. In other words, if we think you had the same ancestors, but some scientists are ready to admit there's not one instance where we can actually say this animal and this animal had the same ancestor. This animal descended from one species, descended from another. We simply cannot verify it in any instance through fossil record or through DNA evidence. Fact is, the subject of taxonomy, and I was told last spring when I taught this, subject of taxonomy, there's certain kinds of plants you don't even know if they're plant or animal. The slime mold. When I was a youngster, they said most biologists believe it's a plant, but we don't know if the slime mold is a plant or an animal. And then there's some things we don't even know if they're alive or not, if they're living or inanimate. Very difficult, and it becomes, on the fringes, becomes iron. Now, Aristotle also believed that the universe was not made up of atoms. He said if the air were made of atoms, it would fall to Earth like a shower of pebbles. Well, he's right. The atoms of air do fall to Earth. That's how come we have air. But go out in space to an asteroid that has a gravity pull that's too weak, and they have no atmosphere because their gravity is not strong enough to hold in an atmosphere. So he was right in that regard. Nevertheless, he set science back by 2,000 or so years. He also is famous for being wrong in that he observed a feather and a rock, dropped the feather and rock, and noticed the rock fell faster than the feather. This has been his most famous mistake in all of history. In a vacuum, a feather falls at the same speed the rock does. In fact, because of him, two of our astronauts that went to the moon carried a feather with them, held up a feather and held up a rock and dropped them. And of course on the moon the gravity pulled them much more slowly than it did on Earth, and the feather and rock hit the moon's surface at the same time. Galileo is said to have climbed the Tower of Pisa, 800 feet, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, 800 feet tall, and dropped a 100-pound iron ball and a half-a-pound iron ball. According to Aristotle, the 100-pound ball should have fallen first. Instead, the half-a-pound ball hit the ground before the 100-pound. Galileo says because the wind held up, slowed down the 100-pound ball more so than it did the half-a-pound ball. So the smaller ball actually hit the ground first. One of his more famous mistakes, he also said that money should not be loaned with interest. He was against interest. He was against money. He said money is sterile. It cannot beget more money. Out the window goes our investing system, our banking system, without which we cannot have a complex economy that we have. The fact is, so what I'm getting at, folk, thanks to Alexander, the philosophy of these three men was to spread over the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, the Roman world, and into the Middle Ages. They destroyed everything they touched. First, they destroyed Greece without them meaning to. Then they destroyed the Hellenistic world, brought it to chaos. Then they destroyed the Roman Empire. I mean, I'm giving a lot of credit to these men for destroying. Then they wound up sending Europe into the Dark Ages. Before Europeans realized, hey, these men were wrong about some things. But they wound up, I think, hey, I can tell, I've been fascinated with all three men, studied them fairly extensively, but I have to come to the conclusion they were wrong. Now, I mentioned earlier, Aristotle was one of the more intelligent men who ever lived, and I've learned the smarter a man is in one area, the less intelligent he is in another area of his life. We see that in a lot of cases. The Chinese have a saying, there's no idea that's, no matter how absurd, but somewhere along the way, some philosopher hasn't embraced that idea. No matter how absurd. And some of Aristotle's ideas, and Plato's, Socrates, were simply absurd. All right. I'll move on. Greek religion. All right, before I move on, any of you have any comments? I mean, I know some of you have heard of Socrates before, Plato, or any other classes. Any of you have anything you want to add? Any comments, questions? Yes?
I just want to clarify. You said that Aristotle believed that the universe was not made of atoms?
He said he believed the universe was not composed of atoms, and without him realizing it, he actually was on the path of setting science back by many, many hundreds of years. So other Greeks had said they believed the universe was made up of atoms. Aristotle ridiculed the idea. And again,
What did he think it was made of?
Elements.
the Greeks believed that the universe consists of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And on this based every thing that the existing universe, earth, anything that was a liquid was water, anything that was solid was earth, anything that burned like the sun or fire was fire, and the rest of it was air. But air was not made up of atoms. I mean, now some of the Greeks believed it was. Aristotle said it wasn't. Again, he lived in the age before the microscope was invented, before the electron microscope. And at one time, I mean 180, 200 years ago, they thought the atoms were the smallest thing in the universe. Then they realized that the atom itself is very large compared to what makes it up, that it's made up of even smaller and smaller particles. And these small particles are made up of even smaller and smaller particles. And ultimately, there must exist a particle that's at the root of it all. They call it the boson particle, otherwise called the God particle, which they think with this big collider they built in Switzerland, between Switzerland and France, that they might have found this boson or God particle. Some of you are looking at me like you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have heard about this. Yes?
Isn't it called Higgs boson?
I think you're right. Thank you, Higgs boson. Thank you for correcting me. Yes, Higgs boson. All right. Boson, that's a ship term.